two hardest jobs on a Monday morning have got to be a quarterback in the NFL and a pastor in the church, because both of them stand in the pocket, feel the pressure, and usually get sacked a few times. So some of you look like you've been sacked. It was a long day. Your lines, your board sort of gave it up, didn't they? Oh my goodness. Keith is just a phenomenal leader. He led IWU so well as a vice president, chancellor-like position, and I was sad to see him come to Southern Nazarene, but I knew that he had Nazarene roots, and I knew that home was going to call him back at some point. So you put him on loan to us, the Wesleyans, the Philistines, but he eventually came back to the land of Judah. So it's when he called maybe a year ago or so and said, any way you can make this happen, I'd do just about anything for him. Just about anything, because he and Carolyn were just phenomenal people. Thank you. What I want to do this morning is just to open up a dialogue. I don't intend to preach. I hope it doesn't. If it gets into preaching, it means that this is failing miserably. I want to really create, if I can, a discussion amongst us and then some feedback. So if you're watching online, then you can send questions in, and I think someone's going to translate those from Hebrew to English so we can try to answer them. Or you can just speak up at any point. Please don't feel like you have to wait for an interruption or a pause in order to just say something that's on your mind. If we do this right, it will be a full and robust crossfire discussion in which we all kind of learn and get better. Okay? Little bit of a background on me. I'm in my third church right now. I've been there not quite 19 years. I started out in a church of 21, 15 were on Social Security, I counted. And it grew maybe to about 65 or 70 before I left, which was 6 years later. So I'm not a great church growth developer at all. I do not know how to get a lot of people to come to my church. Then I left that small church into a mid-sized church of about 140. And I stayed there 11 years. And it was more in the rural community, 3,000 people in that kind of a burg, volunteer, firemen, that whole thing. In the middle of a service, 11 people jump up and run for the exits. You're like, gosh, what did I say? Nothing. Somebody's car's on fire. I was there, as I say, 11 years, and it grew steadily to about 280, 285. Then I feel that God called me to the church at Indiana Wesleyan University, where, as I say, I've been there for 19 years. It had about 600 or 700 when we started. We're at about 1,500 now. My point for saying that is to say that over the last 38, 39 years, I've pastored 3 different sizes of churches. One, a church of about 21, 25. The other, a church of about 150. And the third, a church of, at that point, 700, now 1,500. All 3 of these churches were in different locations. The first was a suburb of Detroit, hence my love for the Lions, my curse. The second, as I said, was in a rural community, heavily volunteer, kind of did you get your deer kind of culture. And then the third, in a collegiate environment, much like this one, where every illustration you use from the pulpit, my brother here feels the same kind of pressure. Somebody in your audience has a PhD in that subject. And they can't wait for the service to end to come and unload a 6-figure information on you about the illustration, what it could have been if you were only more educated. So 3 different environments. What I've learned is that in all 3 of them, leadership changes. The way decisions get made is fundamentally different in a church of 25, in a church of 150, in a church of 1,500. How leaders get power, not elected, but how they get power once they are elected. You can have a board of 15 and still have 3 people run things in any size organization. But how do you identify them, and how do they get that power? What are the expectations of the board? What are the expectations of the pastor? What's the purpose of gathering or worshiping on Sunday? And what happens to the money? All of those questions, they change as the church grows from size to size. But those changes seem small to me compared to the greater changes that are happening in culture. When I started, the stock market was 1,500. This is back in the 1870s. No, not quite. It was 1981. Really, the Dow was 1,500. It's 26.5 right now. Hottest bands were Def Leppard, AC/DC. All four Beatles were still alive. I don't know who the Christian bands were. Stryper. Thank you. Ronald Reagan was president. You see what I mean? If you look at the way the culture has shifted from that time to the present time, these are seismic, tectonic changes. And it's got me wondering where the whole thing is going. So what I'd like to do for a moment is push back from the day-to-day grind, the stuff that's due this coming week, the meetings, the deadlines, and ask yourself a greater question. What is happening in the culture around us? Thomas Merton said, some poets do not become great poets for the same reason most Christians do not become great saints. They never get around to being the kind of person that is called for by the times in which they live. That was a fundamental change for me, because it suggested that a man or a woman could be called according to their times, not according to their passions and their gifts, which is usually the way we make ministers. It suggests that if we operate within our gifts and within our passions, but not according to our times, we can still do our 40 and be irrelevant. It suggests that for a person to operate according to their times, to be what is called for, they must know what time it is. They must know the kind of person that is called for by those times. They must gradually bend their organizations, in this case the church, so that it is capable of producing the kind of people that are called for by those times. Then they must ask themselves whether they have it in them to make those changes. So what time is it? Take a moment. There's a person next to you. If you're online, you can think there for a moment and maybe send your answers in. But if you were to describe the culture in which we live right now, what are some adjectives that you would use? How would you say the culture has shifted in the last 20 to 30 years? What's it like out there in ministry where the church is situated? There's a person next to you, in the room anyway. Turn, find that person, have about a 60-second discussion about that. What is happening to the culture in which we live? Okay? It's been all of 60 seconds. Surely you've got the culture figured out by now. Any great epiphanies? Let the prophets among us speak up, describe our culture. Give me some words that you use to describe the culture out there in which you do ministry.
Flaky.
I'm sorry?
Flaky.
Flaky, okay. All right, yeah, that's loaded with meaning, I can tell. What other ones?
It's a moving target, but also it's a culture that asks for integrity without having any integrity.
Did you hear that? It's a moving target. It's a culture that asks for integrity without having integrity. Others?
Disconnected.
Disconnected?
Technology which is dramatically decreasing our interpersonal interaction.
Okay. Okay. So more technology, less connected.
Right.
Okay. Others?
An angry culture.
Angry. Boy. Divided?
Identity confusion.
Identity. The whole culture or just parts of it?
I just think that parts of it.
Yeah.
Those of us that don't view.
Yeah. A lot of institutions today are having identity crises, aren't they? Yeah. Others?
Highly mobile.
Highly mobile culture. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we can both transit faster, farther. I was in Marion as of last night, and yet we are also connected, right? We can, yeah. One more. Anti-authority. Yeah, there's this kind of kickback against. So ask yourself the question, from what you know of the Bible, is there a time in the Bible that had characteristics similar to the characteristics in which we live today? If you were to find a narrative or an era in the Bible and say, that's a lot like what we're dealing with today, what would that era be? Roman Empire? Jezebel? I'm sorry?
The end of the monarchy in Judah.
Ah, interesting. The last few kings. Interesting, yes.
Maybe in Judges where everybody's doing what was right in their own eyes.
Fascinating. Yeah, he's saying, I'm hearing lots of things. I heard Jezebel. I heard the end of the Judah monarchy. Would that be just before they went into exile then? Yeah, and then I heard the book of Judges. Everyone does what's right in their own eyes over here.
The Laodicean church age, in which the church compromises to get everybody in.
The Laodicean church age. Yeah. So kind of the lukewarm. So now ask yourself this, from what you know of that era or that narrative in Scripture, what advice would you give to us? I'm going to write these down. Clearly, one of the best ways to interpret our times is to find an era in the Bible that is like these times, and then ask yourself, what do I know of those times in the Bible? It allows you to have lived through a period that you didn't really live through. So you can act like you're a lot older than you are, because you've read the story and you're drawing parallels in Scripture. So now what you're doing is you're saying it's like an era. It's either like the Judges or like the just before exile, like the Laodicean age. And you're going to kind of survey what you know from that and ask yourself, what advice would I give us from that era in the Bible? What should the church be doing now to steady itself in these times? Okay, shoot.
Work out of who we are and not what's effective.
I'm going to translate these as you talk. Work out of who we are and what was that?
Not necessarily just what's effective.
Okay.
Pragmatism, but
So I'm going to say preserve our identity. Is that fair? I can erase it if it's not. And not just what's effective. Yes? Okay, thanks. That was a kind of a patronizing, nah, not at all what I said, but sure. All right, others?
Even in the Laodicean church age, the compromising, I believe, we need to hold fast to the truth of the Scripture and not compromising.
Hold to the text. Yep, no compromise. Okay.
Speak prophetically.
Ah,
Can we add live to that also? Speak and live.
yes. Oh, yes. Okay.
If we're gonna do that, we gotta hear from God, so we better be devoted to prayer.
I'm gonna add a word. I'm gonna say pray and listen. So we don't just say, okay, God, I'm done, get back to work, right? Pray and listen and discern. Okay?
What about expository preaching? Do you think, I believe that people still want to hear the word of God.
I'm gonna put that next to the knowing Scripture, expository, okay? Certainly one way of preaching. Others? We pretty much.
Love the people.
Ah, yeah, that's a good one. Man, oh man, people go where they're loved. Love well. Okay, good. Yep. Okay. I believe we're living in a kairos moment. A kairos moment is a period in history where the leaders have very little control. What the church does is not decided so much as discerned. Because there are forces that are controlling the culture that are larger than any leader in that culture. So you cannot declare what you're going to do until you read well what is happening to the culture around you. The fool makes decisions because they can. The wise person listens and watches and stays open for evolutions in the church that they hadn't considered before because the times are different. Alexander Solzhenitsyn called it a knot in the timeline of history. It's that moment when the options become clear, right before decisions harden into fate. The culture is deeply and closely divided. But the divisions are no longer what they used to be. They're not over parties or ideologies or even agendas. They're over destinies. It's a division of the nation's soul. It seems is what's happening. Now, we have been here before, but the difference this time is that the three organizations that used to stabilize us in these periods of transitions are themselves in crises: the government, the church, and the family. All three of them used to stabilize a nation when everything around it was moving, but the government, as you know, is having a crisis of their own. They are deeply divided over every issue. I'm not going to say I'm one party or another because I'm not. Both parties concern me right now, you guys. This is as political as I'm going to get today. It seems to me that both parties are like the woman that came before Solomon to get the baby. Solomon said, I'll cut the baby in half and give half to you and half to her. And one of the women said, great, cut it in half. And Solomon gave it to the other woman because he said, this just proves that the one is not the real mother. It seems to me that both parties are willing to cut the nation in half before they would surrender it to the other party, proving to me that neither one is the mother. The government itself is not a refuge from the storm. They are the storm. And the church. The church has failed. This is as negative as I'm going to get. We have failed to add value to the cities in which we live. We have continued to gather more than we send. We cannot articulate a gospel that is relevant. Because most people today in a secular culture do not think in terms of blood sacrifice. They've never heard of such a thing. So when we speak about Jesus forgiving us by his blood, realize that may be true, but nobody gets that anymore. So how do we convey a gospel to people who are not much interested in Jesus? And aside from that, we have failed to convert even our own. The church is not a refuge from the storm. They are the storm. They're part of the problem. We. This thing that we belong to. Are you okay? Exhale. In the family. We don't even know what family means anymore. We can't define it. We don't know whether it's between two opposite or same genders. The fastest growing family in America right now is the single grandparent. And as Time Magazine reports, while we're still deciding these things, since the definition of family is now on the table, are we sure polygamy is out? Once again, the family is not a refuge from the storm. They are the storm. My wife teaches inside of a school with a 97% poverty rate. 97% of the people are on free lunch. And I get downloads every day about casualties of the American family. This is a whirlwind of chaos. Are you still there? Into this kind of a culture, the church is suddenly thrown, and we are alive. If I were to find a time in the Bible where it felt like it was our time, I would say we are in a time of exile. Very close. In the Bible, exile, you will remember, is not the same thing as captivity. Exile and captivity are two different models. In captivity, you serve a pharaoh at his request, and you do only what he allows you to do. But in exile, they simply transport you to a foreign culture. And you grow up in that culture, and you adapt their value system. So in exile, the threat is not persecution, it's assimilation. The threat is not that you're going to cease to exist. The threat is that you will lose your identity. You will not know who you are. So all of your values and your methods and what you determine success is created by the culture, the dominant culture. You can do what you want, but this is Babylon. And this is what it means to succeed in Babylon. Let's take a break for a second. Not a big one, but let me just hear from you. What are you hearing? What are you hearing?
The method matters.
Yes. Yeah. The medium is the message. Yes. Yep. What you win them with, you win them to. All of that. Yep. Others? Are you there? Unpleasant realities, yes. Yes.
The ways the church succeeded back
Yeah, times are changing. It's, yeah. I'm sorry?
Total reliance on God.
Yeah, we need more reliance on God to be sure. Yeah, yeah. Yes,
Just scripture so speaks to exile, and we were just studying Jeremiah 29:4-7, where it tells them what they're to do in terms of marry and have sons and daughters, and give your daughters to marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, don't
Yeah.
decrease. Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I've carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you will prosper.
yeah, yeah. Powerful in the Jeremiah. I'm sorry? I would have to cite the whole thing. You want me to cite the whole thing?
Just repeat what the question you're saying so the audience will hear.
So Jeremiah 29:4-7.
There it is. Amber has found, for those online, Amber has found in Jeremiah 29:4-7, a pretty good prescription. Remember that? It says, pray for the cities in which you live, plant gardens, build houses, marry your sons and daughters. If the nation prospers, you prosper. You belong to the nation that you oppose. You're not better than them. What happens to them happens to you. That's powerful. Yeah.
I think if we truly believe God is big enough, we have to stop being fearful of being influenced by the culture and be the culture that God wants us to be.
Yes. Yeah. My brother says we have to believe that God is big enough to sustain us, even if we don't agree with the culture. I think things are different in a few ways. One is it feels like the church is losing social capital right now. It feels like we're sort of being pushed to the margins. It feels like our cherished traditions, our nativity scenes, our 10 Commandments, all those kind of things that we used to kind of depend on have now been relocated outside. It's no longer legal. And it feels to Christians like they're losing their ground. The second is there is a loss of financial capital in the church right now. Laws are de-incentivizing giving. Anyone making less than $200K is probably not going to itemize, and therefore a serious candidate for giving less money. Now keep in mind, in order to keep a small church afloat today, and by afloat, all I mean is a local church pastor, they have their own building, they have a moderate program, and they're able to contribute something to the denomination's mission plan. Nothing more than that. In order to keep that church afloat, it takes about $150,000 a year. Then you look at the churches within your denomination and find out how many are actually receiving more than $150,000 in a year from tithes and offerings. And you'll find usually more than half of them are upside down. They're already losing more than they're taking in through offerings. So there's a financial risk as well. Can we continue to sustain a model when people no longer are tithing like they used to? And finally, there is a loss of morale. There is a number of pastors that I talk to that are tired. One of them said to me, Steve, we are doing everything that we used to do harder, and it's getting half the results. And I don't know how much longer I can do it. So as I step back now after the years in ministry and I watch pastors come out of college, I'm next to one. I watch them go into ministry. I find the same thing happens to some of them that happens to school teachers. You come out starry-eyed, full of aggression, going to take on the world, and about 4 or 5 years into it, you start looking for shade. You start thinking, I have got to find some way to make a living that does not require pressure all week long. I'll be a consultant. I'll create my own nonprofit organization. I'll move into administration. But I have got to get out of the deadlines and the pressure. So there's a sagging of morale. I believe that it is a kairos moment. The decisions we make at this time in history are going to harden into fate for the North American church. And yet, at the same time, I have never been more optimistic, more encouraged than I am today. Two things are happening simultaneously. The church is losing social capital. But at the same time she loses social capital, her lay people are coming alive. I've never seen it like this before. They are on fire. It's the lay people that are calling for expository preaching, not the preachers. It's the lay people who want to reinvent the church. The preachers want to keep it the same. There's too much on the line. It is the nature of organizations to hold on to structures long after they become useful. They either used to work and they don't any longer, or they should have worked, but they never did. And organizations by nature tend to hold on to these things. They're like scaffolding around a cathedral to build it. And it's there for so long, you can't tell the difference between the cathedral and the scaffolding. Pretty soon, you move all of your parishioners into the scaffolding. And you forget why you built it. It was to have a cathedral. I call this an Antioch moment. An Antioch moment has four characteristics. One, forces beyond our control are pulling the church into places that we don't want to be, and we can't get anything around it. Two, God is active in places and in ways that are unfamiliar to us. So three, the church faces the decision of saying, do we rein it in or do we release it? And if we release it, then the question is, how do we preserve the core? The third move, do we rein it in or do we release it, is do we make it act like we act, or do we let it take whatever form it wants to take? And if we let it take whatever form it wants to take, is there anything at all in the present system that we should transmit to the new? Are you tracking? The first time we did this was in Antioch. Let me retell very quickly the scene. One, the church begins in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost. They're filled with the Holy Spirit, and people begin to speak in tongues. The world has gathered. They hear the gospel in their own language. 3,000 people are converted in a day. The apostles are all present. They're speaking with force. God has done something brand new in Jerusalem. Yes? Suddenly, there's a persecution. Stephen is stoned in Acts chapter 8. And according to Acts 8, on the day he was stoned, the persecution broke out, and people began to scatter from Jerusalem to all parts of that region, except for the apostles. According to Acts, the apostles all stayed in Jerusalem. So we have something happening in forces beyond our control. Nobody saw this persecution coming. Nobody saw this scattering. As the people left Jerusalem, they began to preach the word of God boldly. Some of them preached it in a place called Antioch. Antioch was like the Chicago of that day. It was the third largest city in the Roman Empire, behind Rome and Alexandria, then Antioch. It was a border town. It lay between the east and the west. There are coins stamped that say the inviolable city of the east, speaking of Antioch. We found them. So it was a border town like San Diego or Detroit. It was not monocultural, it was multicultural. It was 90% Gentiles, but still 10% Jews. Now, here's the problem. When the gospel hit Antioch, the people from Antioch got converted, but they never accepted the Jewish way. They didn't act like a Jew before or after they came to Jesus. People in Jerusalem were all Jews. The ones in Antioch were all Gentiles. They had never been to the synagogue. They didn't know the Torah. They didn't speak Hebrew or want to. But they found Jesus. So suddenly, God is active in another place in ways that are unfamiliar to us. Now, the church had a decision. Do we rein this in, or do we release it? Think about that. Do we start a bunch of Jerusalem church plants in Antioch? Then we could get the Gentiles to come to a Jewish church plant and live like Jews. Do we make Antioch a satellite of Jerusalem? That way, we can control it. Or do we just let Antioch go and assume whatever shape it becomes? And if we let Antioch go and assume any shape it becomes, how do we identify what the core of our gospel is? How do we regulate Antioch without controlling it? Because if we control it, we'll kill it. I believe we live in an Antioch moment. One of the fundamental changes happening in the church right now is the power is shifting from the clergy to the laity. And this is a beautiful thing. Because the laity, yes, they're untrained, uncircumcised. but they are also embedded in the very organizations we're trying to redeem. School systems, businesses, nonprofits, hospitals, locker rooms, this laity, places that you and I will never get because we're Jews. And what startles me, you guys, is the resistance that I feel from fellow clergy trying to control this. So, if we're moving from Jerusalem to Antioch, then a few major changes have got to happen in the church. One of them is we have to stop measuring churches by the number of people who gather in them. A large Jerusalem means virtually nothing to people from Antioch except that you're self-absorbed. You actually send the opposite message, not the one that your DS wants you to send. So we have to go from churches that measure themselves by how many came to how many are being sent. Second, we have to learn how to preach not only to the audience that is in front of us, but through the audience that is in front of us to our audience's audience, people that will never set foot in our sanctuaries. We have to learn to say things that are viral so that the moment, no, let me stop for a second. The way viruses work is genius. It goes like this. When a virus approaches a healthy cell, it asks two questions. One, will you let me in? And if the healthy cell opens itself and lets the virus in, it asks the second. Two, will you reproduce me? The moment the healthy cell reproduces the virus, watch what happens. Within an hour, the virus breaks the wall of that cell and starts to reproduce itself exponentially. Now, the genius of a virus is that it never gathers. If it did, you could cut it out like a tumor. But it is so diffusive in the body and reproducing at such rapidity that you cannot overcome it. If we were to preach virally, the things we would say would be caught by our lay people. Will you let me in? And if they let the idea into them, we would say, will you reproduce me? And by the time the layperson got to Wednesday or Thursday, they would be repeating the things they heard on Sunday, only they would think it was their idea. And they would not be quoting the minister who has no social capital in Antioch. So we're no longer just talking to the people in front of us. We're now talking to the people in front of them. So our church started this is not something we planned. It just happened to us. A few years ago, we started to talk about how to activate the laity in our church. So I was talking to them about what it would mean for them to shepherd people. How do you shepherd people? Because people want to be shepherds. They want a shepherd. They don't know what to call it, so they call it a leader. But what it actually is a shepherd. And if we were to release people into the community as shepherds, taking care of the souls of people that never go near the church, what would be involved in that? By the end of that short 5 or 6 week campaign, there were 388 people gathered onto the platform to be fully commissioned as shepherds in our community. All of them were lay people, no ministers. These were school teachers and coaches, and I started getting emails from a high school principal that said, "This is perfect. I've called all my teachers into a room and I've told all my high school teachers, you're not just going to teach your students, you're going to shepherd them. And here's how you're going to do it." And he sent me the syllabus that he was sending out to them. He has organized Miss Cinema High School, organized his high school around this idea of taking care of the people in front of you, not just, he says, you just happen to be a teacher, that's your job. But what you actually are is someone that takes care of people. It's called soul care. That's what you're doing. Whether you're religious or not, that's what you're supposed to do. So I started to visit these places. I figured the thing to do was to go to Antioch and see them. And so the only thing I asked was, when I come to see you, I just want to sit in the corner of the room. I don't want to say anything. I just want to watch. I go into one room where there's 22 people gathered in an insurance group. Of the 22 people, 15 of them are not part of any church. At least 15 are not practicing Christians nor even confessing. On that particular day, they were talking about something I'd preached a couple of days before: confess and forgive one another. And you guys, what I heard confessed around that boardroom with 22 people was shocking. You don't hear that stuff in small groups. Nobody has the nerve to say it. They're confessing sins in the present tense. They're not talking about what they used to do. They're talking about what they're still doing and they can't conquer. Suddenly, one woman speaks up. She says to the management leader who's leading the discussion, says, some years ago I was married. I was Catholic. Didn't want to be married. It was breaking apart. Went to see the priest. The priest told me what I could do to save my marriage. I wrote it down. Then I promptly told the priest to get and stay out of my life. I went out, and that marriage fell apart. I am now in my second marriage, she said, and it's not going very well. So the other day, I found that list that Father Dennis gave me, and I looked it over. Then she said, starting to cry, "You know, if I'd have done what he told me to do, I'd still be married." There is a pause. The leader of the group steps forward, calls her by name, and says, "Is there any chance you could go back and talk to Father Dennis? Tell him you're sorry. Tell him you want to come back to his parish?" She said, "I can't. I've been excommunicated formally." He says nothing. He turns around, walks up, writes 2 words on the board. He writes, "Jesus forgives." Takes a step towards the woman, calls her by name, and says, "Whatever else you hear this morning, never forget, Jesus forgives." And the thought occurred to me, that woman doesn't have a pastor because he is her pastor, with no formal training. Which leads to the third thing we'll have to do. If the power is shifting from the clergy to the laity, what that means is churches gather now to train and release. Pastors must become resident theologians and scholars again. Remember, that's what reverend used to mean before it meant administrator or therapist. We are going to have to learn how to train and release laity to act like ministers. So you become like bishops, and your lay people are your pastors. Your job is to train them theologically, teach them how to use the scriptures fluently, conversantly, so they can defer to passages without looking them up. And the last thing that we will have to do is we will then have to find a way to commission and or ordain laity who stay in the places where they're already embedded. I can't tell you, I can tell you that, so last year, we did something else in January about what it is to be a one another community. And it wasn't over yet. And we had business people, principals, medical people coming up and taking a photograph of the board and then going back to their workplace, and they're starting to like replicate this in their workplace. And so as I started to go visit these sites, I found that we had over 30 lay people that were actively convening groups during the week in order to disciple them in the business or in the locker room or the high school. Over 30. So I got them all into a room a few times and I said, tell me what you're doing and tell me what you need. How many people are you convening? One of them said, it's a small group of 45. Like, holy cow, that's like a small church. We discovered that we had between 200 and 300 people that were gathering every week in businesses, boardrooms, locker rooms, living rooms, led by laity who don't know what they're doing. Do you realize that a church of between 200 and 300 is in the top 10% of all churches in America? Being led by people from Antioch. Horrifying. So we had to start finding ways to train them. So what we did was now Sunday, whenever I preach, I will either right before the service or right after the service, I will go into a room and I'll shoot a 5-minute video of everything I said. So if I'm using the board, I'm drawing the diagram on the board in 5 minutes. And then what we do is we upload that, and then we send it to all of these lay people. And then we created these like handout sheets that are kind of idiot-proof, and the instructions are right there. Say, this is the subject today. Here's sort of a way to assess your organization to say, how are we doing according to this biblical teaching as a group right now? Here's a couple questions to ask. And finally, it's a 1-page sheet. So then what we did was we hand these things out on Sunday, and then we gave them a link to a 5-minute video. And we said, now this is kind of plug and play. You can go into your boardroom, locker room, whatever you want, and you can just lead the group. Because what we noticed is they're struggling for content. They have the power to convene, but they don't know what to say. And so we had to create the material. So I'd go see people, and when I walk in the athletic director's office, he's got his iPad out and he's taking notes off the 5-minute video. I go into another one, and the guy just goes, all right, before we get started, here, watch this. He waits 5 minutes till it's over with, and then he pulls out the sheet, and he starts asking the questions. And they start to pray. And these prayers are short, but they're visceral. And they're hungry. And they're asking for things that religious people so often have lost touch with. So there's power in these gatherings. One of them said, I didn't even know that I could pray. I didn't know I was allowed to pray. And before I knew it, I was praying at the end of this meeting. All right. That's a lot of stuff. So what you're hearing is that the times are changing. We're in a new era. And one of the major shifts that is happening in our church right now is a shift from the clergy to the laity. This does not mean that clergy are done and over. Remember, the rise of Antioch does not mean the end of Jerusalem. It just means the church is now ambidextrous. It has two arms. But above all, Jerusalem does not try to replicate itself in any form inside of Antioch. It releases Antioch to allowing it to become whatever God wants it to become. But then it sends Paul and Barnabas into Antioch to instruct them, train them in Antioch, not in Jerusalem. So you're hearing we're at a crossroads, and this is one of the major changes that we have got to make. In the second session, after we break for a moment, I want to talk more about this structurally. I want to talk about the different kinds of communities that we tend to have. And sometimes when I talk to leaders about this, it gets, well, shall we say, interesting. So I will take a break in a moment. I'm going to want you to stay and listen to that because we're going to talk about fundamentally changing the definition of what it means to belong to that organization. A few more of the changes and then I'm going to quit. I told you one of the big changes we have to make is a shift from the clergy to the laity. A second major change we'll have to make is, church, we have got to make more durable, countercultural disciples. Disciples whose value system is fundamentally different from the world. It means very little for a person to confess Jesus as Savior and Lord if they still love their money and hate their enemies. Break their promises and keep their grudges. The rabbi in the Sermon on the Mount talked about a different kind of life. We have got to make disciples whose lives are visibly different from the places where they live. Third, we have got to find ways to add value to the cities in which we live. As Amber has read, if the city prospers, we prosper. But we have got to do this without losing our souls. The cities do not need another nonprofit organization. Mine has 121 in a city of 29,000. That's enough. And fourth, we have got to learn how to reinterpret the gospel in a way that matters to an irreligious culture. The gospel we're preaching now, you have to be virtually saved to believe it. You have to buy so many prerequisite assumptions that you're already in the church, virtually at the altar, by the time you first believe. The gospel is not a theological proposition. It is a living, active community.
Could you restate that last?
It is not, the gospel is not a theological proposition.
But I mean back when you got to learn to reinterpret the gospel
To people that are not interested
Okay.
in religion, Jesus in particular. The gospel, as I understand it, is not something that an evangelist preaches to a sinner to try to get him in the church. It is something a prophet preaches to the church to try to get them active in the campaign that God is on. That's the Old Testament gospel. That's what Isaiah preached. And he preached it to religious people, not irreligious people. So it wasn't a set of theological propositions. It was a community that was alive around Yahweh, and now around Jesus Christ. And so to receive the gospel is to make Christ the King of our lives, and to reorient all of our lives, even the private ones, around the values of that King. That's what we have to find. Okay. What's the best thing to do? You want to go to some Q&A right now, or to some comments that you're hearing, and then we go to break? Does that sound like it worked? Was that a note to me? You were doing this? Okay. Oh, yeah, here you go. Let's take comments from the floor. I'm going to sit down for a second.
I'd like you to unpack a little bit more. You said you've got to practically be a part of the church to embrace the gospel. Define for me, what are you calling the gospel?
Well, I'm talking about, in that sense, I'm talking about the traditional gospel, which is man is sinful and separated from God. That's the first thing you've got to believe. People today don't even believe in sin. Donald Trump says, I can't think of anything I've done worth forgiving. Now, the rest of us are like, but he speaks for a lot of the country right now. I don't even know what sin is anymore. So you want me to, and then a blood sacrifice? I don't even know of such a thing. So now again, it's not that these things are wrong, we should stop talking about them. It's just that is so far into the cave of theology, these are not questions people are asking themselves. They're asking other ones.
So what is the gospel that people are asking themselves about?
Their lives. It starts with their lives. Their lives don't work. And they know it. The stuff that they've given themselves to, they either can't have, or when they get it, it's not enough. And it's broken, and they know it. So the gospel, rather than coming in with a series of theological propositions about sin as a system, it comes in and it says, you know what? There is life and there is death. And when things are alive, they're reproducing. They're getting larger. Their horizons are getting further. And when they're dying, they're getting weaker, smaller, more ingrown, and fragile. How's it going for you? And for the first time, in language that is scriptural, now, Deuteronomy 30, I set before you life and death. Choose life so that you and your children may live, right? Now, for the first time, they're understanding their problem in biblical language. In that conversation, it's not too much of a reach for me to say, Christ has come that you may have life and that you may have it to the full. Sir, if there was a better way out there, Jesus would have told you to take it. He's not just trying to win you. He's trying to give you life. He is the smartest guy in the room on any subject. His ways are life. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I think so.
So I'm,
Talking about more the way we present it, understanding
yes,
where the people are.
yes,
Not
yes,
necessarily what the gospel is. I was
Yes.
mixing those things up in my mind.
yes.
Yeah,
Yeah, so I'm finding, and I won't touch it today because there isn't time. I'm finding in the scripture there are several themes that are ways of talking about the gospel, and each one of these themes find their pinnacle in Jesus Christ. All of these themes, I have like 8 or 9, all of them start in the Garden of Eden and they end in Revelation, but their peak is in the Gospels in Jesus Christ. That's the beauty of it. So these are dichotomies. So one is a shift from death to life. One is a shift from captivity or bondage, addiction, to freedom. Yep. One is isolation, alone. The other is union. Jesus said in John 14, just as the Father is in me, I am in you. Translated, I am in you just like the Father is. That is union. Theologians call it perichoresis. But it's an amazing thought. So there's like 8 or 9 of these. And these become kind of talking points for me. So now I can listen to people talk about their lives and things. And as they're talking, describing their families and their work and their lives, in my brain, I'm scanning these 8 or 9 frequencies to say which is the language that this person's talking about sickness and health, or folly and wisdom. And so Jesus opens the eyes.
So the challenge is not the gospel we preach, it's the way we preach the gospel.
Yeah, I think the gospel we preach is too narrow. I think it starts in the middle of the scene. Walt Brueggemann says it has 3 movements. The first one is there is a drama between forces that are over our control. Pharaoh and God, for instance. That's beyond my control. But the second scene is God has broken into this drama and he has announced the victory. How beautiful are the feet of those who bring the gospel, right? And then the third one is because God has announced this victory, we all recalibrate our lives according to the new king. We start living as though that victory is already true, because it is. Does that make sense? So my problem with the gospel that we're preaching is it's just the middle part. We don't talk enough about the drama that's over our head, which is like death, sickness, folly, toil, and we don't talk much about the alignment afterwards. So, broader. Yep. Other comments?
I started on a couple months ago along these lines of trying to make some change. On Sunday mornings, we had the ability to have round tables in the sanctuary, and I call it practice.
Oh, interesting.
And so I have people that like to share their story to the congregation, whatever, but part of the practice, because I realized the church, I've been there 15 years, they like to hear my story.
Nice.
I'm a chaplain at a factory, and then at Walmart, I don't shop, I'm just looking for people. that kind of stuff.
Interesting.
I'm at the place now that I can't tell them we're gonna practice Sunday. We don't do it every Sunday,
Yeah,
because they're scared to death. As far as if when they come in with the round tables, it's kinda like, oh, brother, we're here to practice.
yeah.
And trying to make those changes, and I find myself, I'm not sure if I'm being real effective. But it just seemed like that was the right thing to do.
Beautiful, boy, beautiful, brother. Man, oh man. So you literally are becoming more of a training ground than a campground. Yeah.
I feel real effective. Trying.
One more comment, then we're going to go to break if you want to make it. Anyone?
I keep hearing in my mind,
Oh, nice. Thanks.
I keep hearing something that Jerry Porter said once before at a meeting for preachers. He said we sometimes need to realize we may use different methods, but we cannot change the message.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, the message has got to remain the same.
Well, we have to change the language.
Yeah, I have a brother who says we got to change the language of it somehow, so it seems more pertinent to what is happening in the day. Yeah, I sure don't want to lose the core of the message, man. It changed me. My goodness.